Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, as we continue the tale of the Sabbat World's Crusade. Warmaster Slaydo's initially optimistic estimates that the Crusade could be brought to a swift and victorious conclusion have been proven very, very misleading, as Operation Newfound has failed on both levels. The rapid slicing pincer maneuver from the north and south was blocked before it could even get off the starting line, and the center line assault, albeit more successful, also failed to secure a decisive breakthrough. And now, with the arch-enemy's forces evidently feeling bold enough to launch counterattacks of their own, the pressure is on the Warmaster to come up with something special, and Slaydo believes that he has. Archon Nadzibar's reckless counterattack had revealed to the Warmaster that he was under just as much pressure as Slaydo was for a decisive confrontation. And with chaos chomping at the bits, all the Warmaster had to do was fulfill their expectations. With false communications reports and orders going out from fleet headquarters at a rapid clip, it appeared to Chaos and its agents within Imperial High Command as if it was preparing for an enormous push towards Fabia, where Chaos were planning to launch their trap on the Imperial invaders and defeat them in one stupendous struggle. But Chaos, just like the Imperium, needed to first organize these forces. As they were going to throw everything into the war, they needed an enormous stockpile of food, weapons, energy, fuel, etc., before they could set out for Fabia. This is the same thing that the Imperial forces had been doing up until this point, with the capture of planets like Fornax, Aleph, and Sverren. They were setting up the supplies needed for a major offensive. But Chaos, with the losses of several of these worlds, only had one potential staging ground. Only one planet with the requisite resources and the required Mandeville points to gather their scattered troops. Balhaut. Any Chaos trap centered around the world of Fabia must first be armed on Balhaut. All Chaos forces, all Chaos leadership, all Chaos fleet reserves had to be centered on Balhaut, including the Archon Nadzibar and his inner circle. This was the head of the serpent, and Warmaster Slaydo's plan was to decapitate that serpent. It was a risky gamble, and one that required the absolute utmost security, and many, many layers of deception, including when Slaydo started to publicly champion the ideas of Lord Militant Sibon to abandon the drive towards Balhaut and instead move for a rimward assault. Something that pissed off Sibon to no end, as he was forced to play along with the deception and see what he viewed as an entirely reasonable plan be used as nothing more than another deception for the Warmaster's own ploys. But, crucially, it worked. And the move of millions of men and an enormous Imperial Navy flotilla complement was achieved without the enemy noticing. Slaydo's plan had achieved that most desirable and elusive of military effects: complete strategic surprise. That didn't mean that the ensuing war was going to be an easy one, however, as Balhaut, now being a central focal point for the arch-enemy's forces, was ridiculous ridiculously heavily defended. But fortunately, to crack a nut like this, the Imperium had also brought along its biggest hammer. And the first part of it to make contact with the Chaos opposition was, of course, the Imperial Navy, who had been given the exceedingly straightforward task of simply smashing as much arch-enemy shipping in orbit as possible. The ensuing Imperial void superiority would then allow for concentrated orbital bombardment against massed enemy troops, followed by a 3-stage Imperial Guard invasion of the planet. This invasion would be focused on 3 geographical objectives, as well as, of course, the general strategic objective of the destruction of the arch-enemy's forces and the apprehension and execution of its leaders. These objectives were Zabe's City, to be taken by Marshal Blackwood, Boros Hive, Ascension Valley, and High Ascension, collectively referred to as the Western Plains objectives, to be seized by Lord Militant Sibon. An important task, possibly handed to the Lord Militant, to salve his pride for his part in the ruse. The Island Hive of Bruna would be the task of General Scalia. Pacification of wider Baal Prime went to Marshal Kater, and the occupation of the refinery complexes at Giteria to General Sultan. Leaving the biggest jobs, the assault on Belopolis to General Kurel, and the taking of the oligarchy itself, the heart of the enemy's resistance on the world and in the city of Belopolis, to Slaydo himself. The remaining high officers were relegated to the reserves and to overseeing the reinforcement process. Notably, Hector Drevere was amongst those sidelined in the rear. A snub he was not going to soon forget. All well and good in theory, however. The plan was sound, the element of surprise was complete, and the Imperium had as far as they were able to tell anyways, absolute superiority in forces. Even more importantly, they were able, with void dominance near assured, to deploy those forces wherever they wanted, further guaranteeing local superiority. Of course, this was all before a shot had actually been fired in anger, and as we have seen previously, the opposition often has an objection or two to raise before the victory parade is a go. So let's stop beating around the bush and get on with it. The Imperial Navy's own plans for the invasion of the Balhaut system was no less intricate than that of the Imperial Guard's plans to seize the world in and of itself. The Imperial Navy had concocted a 4-point plan for the seizure of the space surrounding Balhaut. The main strength of the Imperial Navy's efforts, containing the majority of its heavy vessels and capital ships, would be organized into an assault contingent, which would enter the system at its extreme edge and on the opposite side of the system's star from Balhaut, hoping that the radiation from the stellar body and the continuous comings and goings of the arch-enemy's own vessels would hide their warp signatures as well as their real space drive signatures. This force would be under the command of Admiral Christa, and its primary purpose, beyond the simple annihilation of the arch-enemy's Vahedwak naval forces, was the protection of the second wave of ships. These were primarily mass transports and their escorts. They would enter into the system after the main assault forces, also attempting to make a secretive approach on the outer rims of the system, before translating into large sugar and hydrocarbon clouds at the system's edge. This main landing forces commander, Vice Admiral Garnhorst, believed that splitting the Imperial Navy's forces would make it less likely that the enemy would detect either formation, trusting in stealth rather than brawn. Of course, placing tens of millions of Imperial Guardsmen in poorly armed and armored metal boxes in the middle of space with only the slightest of security details to guard it was a risk. A potentially Crusade-ending risk, but it was a well-considered one. Due to the second wave arriving at the outer edges of the system and then translating slowly at minimal power into concealment, even if they were discovered, they would in all due likelihood be able to exit the system before the formation suffered serious casualties. Of course, if it was forced to do so, it would probably mean the end of the invasion of the Balhaut system, but better that than the millions of casualties that would be incurred should the fleet formation be destroyed. Additionally, the third wave was anticipated and expected to distract the enemy sufficiently to the point where even if they had detected the first or the second wave, they would be unable or unwilling to dedicate significant resources to identifying either wave or pursuing them. This third wave would be under the command of Admiral Shaver, and it would consist primarily of faster assault warships. They would enter the system deep within the confines, easily detectable by the enemy's auger arrays. They would then detect what appeared for all the world to be a raiding force, not a main battle line. There might be a few grand cruisers in the formation here and there, as incidental and extra firepower if required, but the majority of the ships would be cruisers from a light to medium disposition, frigates and destroyers, the kind of force you would send in if you were intending to try and disrupt the enemy's preparations for a major battle around Fabia, for example. Meaning that Chaos's most likely reaction would be not to flee or begin an evacuation of Balhaut, but rather to rise to resist these interlopers, which would in turn leave the Hedwak forces raising to intercept the Imperial forces, as well as Balhaut and its high anchorages, distracted and open to assault by the first wave formation of battleships. And finally, after the Void War was all but settled, the fourth wave under the command of Vice Admiral Saint-Lecu would arrive with a few escorts and the majority of the reinforcements and the supporting orbital elements. Once again, on paper, everything seemed perfect. And initially, the operation went off without a hitch. The first and second waves both entered system with no detectable signs that the enemy had noticed their presence, and both waves arrived at their jumping off points without any reaction from the Hedwak naval elements. Now it was all up to Admiral Shaver to spring the trap, and so he did right on time, drawing the Arch-enemy's forces towards his own raiding formation. The two forces engaged one another in battle, and the opening phases of the Void War would last for a full 6 hours, during which time Admiral Christor's first wave would reveal themselves from behind the system's star and close upon Balhaut and the rear of the enemy's fleet. The pincer movement from the first and the third wave were a complete success, crushing the enemy's fleet between their teeth, costing the arch-enemy over half of their combined naval tonnage in those opening 6 hours. At which point all organized strategic-level Chaos fleet resistance had ceased. Thereafter, it would be smaller-scale engagements with individual packs and local Hedwak commanders. And the Imperial Navy had lost a relatively measly 9% of its own forces, primarily amongst the lighter elements of the third wave, including Admiral Shaver and his vessel, the Myrmidon, with Vice Admiral von Hagel stepping in to take over command of the third wave. The battle would continue for another 15 hours, with larger and smaller Verheadwork formations that still tried to cling to void superiority above Balhaut, trying to shelter within range of its own anti-orbital defenses and those of the orbital stations that were still intact, most of which had already been smashed in the opening 6 hours by the first wave's main battle line. They were, in all due likelihood, attempting to see if they could perhaps stage some sort of evacuation from the planet, at least of higher command personnel, and some were known to escape from Balhaut during this period. But with the Imperial Navy continuing its offensive, there really was no good opportunities to carry out any sort of extensive evacuation. Best they could do would have been to snatch up individual officers or their entourages before fleeing out of system. After a grand total of 21 hours, the Imperial Navy finally gave the all clear. Complete void superiority had been achieved over Balhaut, and its primary anti-orbital defenses had been destroyed. Now, the fleet could begin concentrating in on orbital bombardment duties, whilst the second wave, and eventually the fourth wave, could start approaching the planet. They would have to run through their own preparations, of course, before the land invasion could commence, but there was plenty of time to do it in, as the orbital bombardment stage of the invasion would be a lengthy one, with a full 12 hours being committed to saturation attacks all over the planet, before the first lead Imperial Guard forces could begin their landing. Even at that point, during the 33rd hour of the operation, there were still orbital strikes being carried out, but these were now being slowly scaled back as the Imperial Guard commenced their deployment. In grand total, during the height of operations, more than 7 million transorbital vehicles would be operational at the same time, ferrying men, equipment, and ammunition down and back up again, from the fleet to Balhaut. However, the Imperium's one-sided run of victories as planned would come to a sudden end here, as it swiftly became evident that the non-anti-orbital defenses of the world were significantly stronger than anticipated, and the 12 hours of orbital bombardment had been nowhere near enough to reduce the enemy's air defenses, with 32% of the total landing force destroyed in transit or within an hour of making landfall. To the north of one of the primary objectives, the oligarchy, that percentage was a lot higher, with 84% of total troops deployed neutralized during landing operations. Millions of troops died without ever even seeing the planet that they were fighting for. And even the forces that had made it down, more or less intact, were in for one hell of a fight. On the western continent, Lord Militant Sibon found himself embroiled in a massive, grueling conflict with rapid reaction arch-enemy forces. The orbital bombardment was supposed to have smashed the enemy's maneuver elements, but facing off against dozens of motorized regiments and armored squadrons, the Lord Militant would no doubt beg to differ with the Navy's estimate. Nor would he be the only one to curse the Navy that day, as General Oliphant's assault on the Tark Islands was plagued by inaccurate orbital estimates, seeing several bulk landers set down in the ocean, dooming the men on board to either a death by drowning or a helpless slaughter at the hands of the enemy's shore batteries. On the bright side, the Guard Regiment under Marshal Blackwood managed to seize Zabe City in just a couple of days, and the refineries at Gitarian too were captured relatively quickly and fairly intact, providing quite a bit of relief for the invasion's logistical officers, who had feared the need to ferry in fuel from out of system in the case of a long-term campaign, which would have left the Imperium's supply lines dangerously exposed to the now countless Chaos warships scattering all throughout the Balhaut system and its surrounding planets, as the Chaos warships were simply jumping into the warp wherever they could, in a desperate attempt to escape their Imperial Navy pursuers. The scattered and broken forces would come to haunt the Imperium for quite some time, but more about that later. As down on the planet, really all of the other battles, horrible though they were, paled in comparison to the fight for the mega city of Bopis and the Oligarchy Palace itself, an enormous series of concentric fortifications that represented the heart of the enemy's command structure. Slaydo's forces had been hammered to a complete pulp just by their landing efforts alone, and it was nothing short of an administrative and strategic miracle, along with the sheer enormous size of the forces under the Warmaster's command, second only in size to the continent-conquering force under Sabbat, that allowed Slaydo to somehow cobble together a fighting force from the scraps he had left and launch it at the oligarchy. Fortunately, General Kurel's command had arrived far more intact, and could carry out a more general assault on the city. This was probably the only reason why Slaydo's command survived the first day. As in the throne rooms of the Chaos commanders, they saw themselves threatened by major throne forces on two fronts. Unable, largely due to Slaydo's bold decision to launch his tattered troops forward, thus obfuscating his vulnerable position with aggression, to decide to hold one and counterattack the other with the elite forces of the two magisters present, Sholan Skara and his infamous Kith Death cultists, and Heritor Asphodel, still in possession of a significant stable of his hellish woe machines. Had the Archon managed to seize the initiative at Bopis or the Oligarchy, and flung his almost certainly numerically superior cultist armies at Kurel or Slaydo in isolation, the battle for Balhaut and the entire Crusade might have had a very different outcome. But for one reason or the other, the crafty arch-enemy commander was pinned passively to these two objectives, defending, and fiercely so, no question, but ultimately surrendering the initiative, and thus the ability to dictate the outcome of the battles. The answer to this seemingly out-of-character behavior is probably the same one underpinning the counterattack at Severin months before. With Imperial forces on their very doorstep, and the Archon self-evidently caught with his pants around his ankles, would probably have commanded very little true respect or obedience from his magisters at the time. This would also explain his later actions against the Warmaster's person. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Passive or no, the heretical defenders of Bopis were turning every inch of the massive city into a fortification. There was a rifle shooting from every window. Every pile of rubble hid a tank, or a cannon, or an artillery piece. Every avenue was swept by stubber fire, and every alley filled with mines and IEDs. Every room had to be cleared with grenades or flamethrowers, and the arch-enemy soldiers would constantly launch fierce counterattacks, undoing previous advances bought with the blood of guardsmen. General Kurel himself would bleed as he was wounded and evacuated during the 48th hour of the invasion. His replacement, General Orson, was killed 5 hours later in the rush and push of unending urban warfare. His replacement, Marshal Benz, was dead within another 5 hours, and his replacement again, General Deliani, couldn't even make it to the front, as the men under his command were already pinned in place by unending Chaos counterattacks. Any attempt for him and his bodyguard unit to break away and to move to take command would only end in another dead officer. Thus, it fell to a lowly commander, already on scene, to take charge of the attack on Belopolis, a commander by the name of Makaroth, whom Slaydo issued the brevet rank of Marshal a few hours later to give him some semblance of authority over the theatre of operations now de facto under his command. The wider situation on Balhaut would remain more or less in the balance for several more days. The attack on Boros Hive on the western continent was grinding down to a simple bloody exchange of bodies, as Sibon fought both to secure the hive and pin down and destroy the enemy's mobile elements harassing his every move forwards. The first real change came with the deployment of the White Scars on the 5th day, as the Astartes secured a breakthrough by routing Manchester Kul Kolesh's hosts from the outer walls of the oligarchy, killing the enemy Manchester in the process. The outer walls was but the first of several concentric defences to fall, but it at long last allowed Slaydo to move out from the cratered plains he had so far occupied and into the guts of the defences. No longer trapped with precious little cover beneath the enemy's guns, there was now a real opportunity to make some headway. On the 6th and the 7th day, the Navy's 4th wave finally arrived as well, and reinforcements were made available for all the ongoing offensives. Troops could now be cycled out from the front and replaced by fresh, eager troops. And more important even than that was that they belonged to intact formations, not already mauled by the massive orbit-to-surface casualties suffered by the first invasion waves and the days of preceding combat. This led to a second breakthrough on the 7th, as Space Marines from the Silver Guard, led by their chapter master Vigum, managed to crash through and stick themselves fast on the other side of yet another line of fortifications. They were then subsequently stopped dead and nearly reversed by a concentration of enemy dreadnoughts and the Heritor's woe machines. But reinforcements were swiftly rushed their way on the Warmaster's command, with 4 armoured and 1 motorized regiment moving in to, I would not be so callous as to say, rescue the Silver Guard. Now the impasse was beginning to break. With a force of armor behind him, Vigum and the Silver Guard, supported by Imperial Guard troops, including the famous Volporn 50th, the Blue Bloods, stormed through the Emancipatory in a mere 2 hours, culminating in the storm attack on the monastery of St. Kyodros. A general panic was now beginning to spread amongst the defenders. A rout occurred as they rushed back to the oligarchy proper and the main curtain walls. Seeing an opportunity, the Jantine patricians and the 11th Mordian Iron Guard managed to take and occupy the precinct of the oligarchy gates, promising a potential swift strike on the gates themselves. And a potential opportunity for Dravir to seize some serious credit, too, as the Jantine patricians were of course one of his favoured formations. Realizing the danger, however, Chaos threw everything it had at recapturing the precinct. The patricians and Mordians held the precinct for 3 hours against tens of thousands of screaming cultists before being bodily thrown back, only to take the night to reorganize and retake the precinct the next morning. But the gates themselves stood firm. Also benefiting from reinforcements, Makaroth at Belopolis had managed to shore up his lines on the 6th and 7th day. For a while there, it looked like the entire Imperial effort against the city would collapse. There was, for all intents and purposes, no front line, each regiment fighting a desperate battle for simple survival, with little to no overarching command or plan. Makarov himself was down in the very thick of it, issuing orders through a battered, high-gain voxcaster to anyone he could reach, whilst stopping in the bombed or burned-out ruins of houses before pushing on again. It was a feat of astounding military ability, as Makarov somehow kept the details of the maelstrom of unorganized battle fresh in his mind, updating it and issuing orders almost entirely from instinct that would draw thousands of scattered and disparate little pieces together into a winning strategy, ultimately securing a brilliant victory for the Imperial history books in the early hours of the 9th day, as the last few fortified blockhouses of the city fell to his triumphant guardsmen. It was news that would have been well received by Slaydo, who would not receive the news until the 10th day, and who had grown increasingly despondent and desperate. He had practically written off Bopis as lost. But the 9th day brought news not only of Makarov's success, but Sibon's as well. At Ascension Valley, he had effectively pinned the enemy against the coast, and with troops relieved from the long and bloody but ultimately successful capture of Baruna Hive, as well as reinforcements from a Titan Legion, he drove forth and in a cataclysmic armored battle shattered Magister Quell's armies, destroying their resolve and organization, sending their remaining forces hounded and scattered into the wastelands, securing the western continent for the Imperium. This day would also see the fall of the Oligarchy Gate. With the Tower of the Plutarch, the central palace itself well within sight, the Silver Guard were thrown in to break the gate. But this was one time that the mighty spearhead of the Emperor's Angels was not enough by itself. Massacred by the Heritor's last reserves of war machines, the Silver Guard was stopped dead, and it fell to the spear shaft, the Imperial Guard, to push the weapon on and through the gates, with the Hyrcan 8th Regiment being the first to mount the mighty portcullis and throw them open for the Imperium's soldiers. And as a side note, this is also one of the very first mentions of a certain recently elevated commissar, one Ibram Gaunt, who was at the time attached to the Hyrcan 8th, and supposedly distinguished himself in the attack upon the gates. The commissar was later reported as killed in action during one of the follow-up assaults on the Inner Palace, but seeing as his name can also be found on the honor rolls of the Battle of Balhaut, including both a citation for honor and bravery and the apparent reward of a personal command. A very generous one too. 3 regiments with armor, infantry, and artillery to be levied from some recently secured worlds. Tarnith? A bit of a backwater system to the south, apparently. Anywho, as mentioned, this seems to contradict the commissar's supposed passing. But to return to matters of substantially more import, with only the final palace yet to be taken, the war for Balhaut was coming to a close. But Slaydo was by all accounts not feeling very triumphant. The Warmaster had come across as distracted, preoccupied, or otherwise waylaid for quite some time to his closest advisors. He had chosen the name of the operation Hellstorm, seemingly for some random reason, a name as good as any, he had figured, apparently. But the name had come back to haunt him, as he now talked about having sent his men into a hellish storm, from which far too few would emerge. And when he was told by Colonel Helmut of the Praetor that the palace will be ours but for a few thousand lives, Slaydo was reported as saying, "Start with mine," and thereafter insisted on leading the final escalation personally. In which efforts, after breaching the Inner Palace, the Warmaster was sought out by the Chaos Archon Nadzibar, whom, unlike many others of his Manchesters, the Heritor and Shoal and Skara, most notable amongst them, had not chosen to flee the planet, probably realizing that unless he personally claimed the head of the man who had vexed and humiliated him, then the Archon would not be in any position to command respect from the rest of the ranks of his Chaos forces. Thus, in an epic confrontation, the likes of which one rarely finds outside of the confines of a storybook, the already wounded Slaydo defeated and mortally wounded the Chaos Anarch, and with his death, all further Chaos resistance disintegrated, securing both victory and Slaydo's eternal place in the history books. But it came, of course, at the cost of the Warmaster's own life, something the Warmaster appeared to have been fully prepared for. Others would later suggest that the Warmaster had known for a virtual fact that Balhaut would be his final resting place, that he had been beckoned by some greater purpose to fulfill his destiny on Balhaut, and then pass on command of the Crusade to someone capable of bringing it to a final victorious conclusion. And there were many candidates, all too ready to take up that mantle, and yet on his deathbed, Slaydo appointed a successor. Now this in and of itself was not at all too crazy. The Imperium is an organized war machine, to be sure, but, as we have seen with the appointment of the Warmaster in the first place, personal desire and a thirst for glory a bit too often overcome the more disciplined and necessary choices and actions of higher Imperial command echelons. And with several commanders poised to take up the role of Warmaster, Hector Drever and Sibon being amongst them, there was every possibility that a schism could form. And so as to avoid this, the Warmaster should and did appoint a successor. But his choice left much to be desired by the other commanders, as it fell upon the man who had brought about the miraculous victory at Bopis, Brevet Marshal Makaroth. Now certainly he had just proven himself at Bopis. He had pulled off a victory that even Slaydo had thought impossible, but this wasn't just skipping a rank or two. This was Makaroth entering an entirely different level of command. He had, at most previously, commanded a handful of regiments. At Bopis, he had commanded an army. A serious undertaking with a significant quantity of troops, no doubt, but nothing compared to running a crusade. Which would of course not only be on an entirely different scale, of course, but it would offer up entirely different challenges. So Makaroth had proven himself capable of engaging with a large-scale tactical problem, alright, but a crusade requires something completely different. Not mere tactics, but grand strategy, on not even, again, merely a planetary scale, certainly not a city scale, but on a system scale, on a crusade level. Makaroth also had no experience with that kind of logistical problems, the arming, fueling, and feeding of billions of men. Not to mention the diplomatic intricacies of high command, or the necessity to cooperate with the Imperial Navy, or the Adeptus Astartes, or the Mechanicus of Mars. Slaydo had a long history of exactly this kind of high-level politicking and strategic decision-making, which is why he was made Warmaster. Makarov had a history of neither. The most in the vein of politics he would ever have been likely to deal with would be the petty squabbles between regimental commanders. Not to mention as well that his low status in comparison to the other contenders would leave him immediately at a disadvantage opposite aforementioned Imperial Navy, the priesthood of Mars, and the Astartes. Why should any of these august organizations respect him? Why should they obey him? It seemed a baffling decision, as likely to tear the Crusade apart as any amount of infighting, and yet, on his deathbed, the Warmaster brokered no disagreement. Makarov was his successor, and that was that. And disobeying the direct orders of a hero of the Imperium who had just won Balhaut at the height of an Imperial Crusade, that was not very good politics either for any of the other contenders. So for now, Makarov it was. Whether or not it would stay Makarov, however, that was a far more open-ended question that we will engage with some other time. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.